The rain hammered against the windows of the Old Bailey as Marcus Whitfield stood in the dock, his hands trembling imperceptibly against the cold wood. It was October 15th, 1998, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Sarah Pemberton, barely 30 and hungry for recognition, adjusted her wig with practiced confidence. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, her first murder trial as lead prosecutor. "Mr. Whitfield," the judge's voice echoed through the chamber, "you stand accused of the murder of Daniel Hayes. How do you plead?" Marcus lifted his gaze, his grey eyes finding his wife Emma in the gallery. 7 months pregnant, she clutched their 5-year-old son Thomas's hand, her face pale but resolute. Marcus's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Mr. Whitfield?" the judge pressed. His court-appointed barrister, an overworked public defender named Gerald Morrison, stood nervously. "My lord, my client chooses to remain silent." Sarah's eyes gleamed. She had expected a fight, prepared for denials and elaborate defenses. This silence, it was practically a gift. She rose, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "My lord, the prosecution will demonstrate that Marcus Whitfield, driven by greed and desperation, murdered his business partner for £1 million insurance policy." The evidence unfolded like a meticulously crafted narrative. The murder weapon, a crystal paperweight from Marcus's own desk, bore his fingerprints. 3 witnesses testified to a violent argument between the partners that very afternoon. Financial records showed their import business drowning in debt, with Marcus's personal accounts overdrawn by thousands. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sarah's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, "the defendant's silence speaks volumes. An innocent man would scream his innocence from the rooftops. Mr. Whitfield cannot defend what is indefensible." Throughout it all, Marcus remained mute, his eyes occasionally drifting to a spot on the floor, as if seeing something beyond the courtroom's confines. When the forensic expert detailed the brutal nature of the attack, Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his weathered cheek. Emma watched her husband with an intensity that seemed to communicate across the space between them. When their eyes met, she mouthed 3 words: "I trust you." Marcus's jaw clenched, his resolution hardening. Gerald Morrison attempted a defense, suggesting reasonable doubt, pointing to the lack of direct witnesses to the murder itself. But without Marcus's testimony, without his voice to give life to an alternative narrative, the defense crumbled like sand against the tide of Sarah's methodical prosecution. On the trial's final day, as Sarah delivered her closing argument, she turned to face Marcus directly. "Your silence, Mr. Whitfield, is not nobility. It is the last refuge of a guilty man who knows that words would only further condemn him." Marcus finally looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't defiance or anger, it was something closer to pity, mixed with a profound sadness. For a moment, Sarah felt an inexplicable chill, but she pushed it aside. This was her moment, her career-defining case. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. "Guilty," the foreman announced, and the word echoed through the courtroom like a death knell. Emma collapsed against the bench, Thomas burying his face in her shoulder. Marcus stood straighter, as if the verdict had lifted rather than crushed him. As the guards prepared to lead him away, Marcus turned one last time toward his family. He pressed his hand to his heart, then extended it toward them, a gesture of love that needed no words. Emma stood, tears streaming, and returned the gesture. 23 years had transformed London's skyline, but the Old Bailey remained unchanged, a monument to justice that Sarah Pemberton now navigated with the confidence of a Queen's Counsel. Her chambers overlooked the very courtroom where she had made her name. The Whitfield case had launched her into the stratosphere of legal excellence, the young prosecutor who had secured conviction in the silent prisoner case. This September morning in 2021, Sarah reviewed briefs for another high-profile murder trial when her secretary knocked. "Ms. Pemberton, there's a man here to see you. Says his name is Marcus Whitfield." The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's fingers, shattering against the Persian rug. Marcus Whitfield was supposed to be serving life. Her hands shook as she pulled up the database. Compassionate release, 3 weeks ago. Terminal pancreatic cancer. Estimated 6 weeks to live. Send him in, she heard herself say. The man who entered bore little resemblance to the robust businessman from her memories. Cancer had carved deep hollows in his cheeks, turned his skin translucent, but his eyes, those grey eyes that had haunted her occasionally over the years, remained sharp and clear. "Hello, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice raspy from disease and disuse. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Whitfield," Sarah managed, professional composure fighting with shock. "I must say, this is unexpected." Marcus lowered himself carefully into the chair across from her desk, a worn leather satchel in his lap. 23 years of silence, he said softly. "I think it's time I spoke." Sarah's mind raced. Was this a threat? An appeal for help? "If you're seeking to overturn your conviction—" "No," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'm dying, Sarah. What I seek is understanding. And perhaps in some small way, redemption, not for me, but for a system that failed us both." He opened the satchel with deliberate care, removing a journal bound in cracked leather, followed by manila folders yellowed with age. "Every piece of evidence I'm about to show you, I've had since before the trial. I've added to it over the years, but the core truth, I've always known it." Sarah leaned back, arms crossed. "Then why didn't you present it? Why the silence?" Marcus smiled sadly. "Because Daniel Hayes was more than a business partner. He was a monster who held my family hostage with secrets that weren't mine to tell." He opened the journal to a page covered in neat handwriting. "Daniel had been embezzling from our company for 3 years, feeding a gambling addiction that had spiraled beyond control. When I discovered it, I confronted him. That was the argument your witnesses saw. But Daniel had an insurance policy of his own." Marcus pulled out a photograph. Emma at a medical conference, standing next to a man Sarah didn't recognize. "My wife, in her younger years, made a mistake. One patient, one error in judgment regarding pain medication that could have cost her license. Daniel knew. He had documentation falsified to make it look like systematic fraud rather than a single moment of compassion for a dying patient." Sarah felt the foundation of her certainty beginning to crack. "You're saying—" "I'm saying Daniel gave me a choice that day. Take the fall for his murder, which he assured me would happen one way or another, or watch Emma be destroyed, our children left with nothing and no one." Marcus's voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. "So when I found Daniel's body that evening, when I picked up that paperweight in shock, leaving my fingerprints, I knew my fate was sealed. The real killer was someone Daniel owed money to, a man named Vincent Carver, enforcer for the Henley gambling syndicate." Marcus produced a photograph, grainy but clear enough. A man leaving the building 30 minutes after the supposed time of death. The detective assigned to the case, Detective Inspector Reginald Brooks, owed the same people money. He buried this evidence, adjusted the timeline, ensured my conviction. Sarah stared at the photograph, her legal mind already cataloging inconsistencies she had missed 23 years ago. If this is real, why didn't you come forward after Daniel's death? The threat would have died with him." Marcus laughed, a sound like autumn leaves. "You think Daniel worked alone? Vincent Carver made it clear. My silence bought my family's safety. One word from me, and Emma's fraud would surface, or worse." He pulled out another document. 3 other prisoners who tried to help me appeal over the years. Look at their names." Sarah scanned the list, her blood running cold. All 3 had died in prison within months of filing paperwork on Marcus's behalf. "Accidents," the reports claimed. "Unfortunate altercations." "My son Thomas became a journalist," Marcus continued, pride flickering in his eyes. "Started investigating 5 years ago, carefully, quietly. He found witnesses who were never interviewed, CCTV footage that was mysteriously corrupted, financial records showing Daniel's debts to people who broke bones for late payments. Sarah's hands trembled as she examined each piece of evidence. Her career, her reputation, built on sending an innocent man to prison. "We need to file an appeal immediately. I'll represent you myself." "Sarah," Marcus interrupted softly, "I have perhaps 6 weeks to live. The legal system moves slowly, and Vincent Carver died in 2015. Detective Brooks suffered a stroke last year. He's in no state to testify. What would an appeal accomplish except to drag my family through more pain? Then why show me this? Why now?" Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intense despite his frailty. "Because you're about to prosecute another murder case, the Jameson trial, and the lead detective, Brooks' protege, Detective Inspector Michael Hartley." Sarah's breath caught. The Jameson case was her next career-defining moment. A young mother accused of killing her abusive husband. The evidence seemed solid, but "I'm not saying Hartley is corrupt," Marcus continued, "but I'm asking you to look deeper, to question what seems obvious, to remember that silence doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes it means survival." He stood slowly, leaving the journal and documents on her desk. "I don't want revenge, Sarah. You were young, ambitious, doing your job with the information you had. But that young woman in the Jameson case, she reminds me of myself 23 years ago, terrified, cornered, with reasons for silence that the court won't understand unless someone makes them listen." Sarah found her voice. "Marcus, I destroyed your life." "No," he said firmly. "Daniel destroyed my life. The system failed us both. You were a tool, as was I. But you have power now, influence. You can change things." As he reached the door, Sarah called out, "Your family, Emma Thomas, do they know you're here?" Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his gaunt features. "Emma knows everything. She always has. She's waiting in the cafe downstairs, actually. After 23 years, she still waits for me." He paused. "Thomas doesn't know I'm here. He's still fighting to clear my name, even though I've begged him to let it go. Some battles, Sarah, aren't meant to be won. They're meant to teach." After Marcus left, Sarah sat surrounded by evidence of her greatest triumph turned into her greatest failure. She picked up the phone, then set it down, picked it up again. Finally, she dialed. "Michael, it's Sarah Pemberton, about the Jameson case. I need you to re-examine everything, every witness, every piece of evidence, and Michael. Check who else might have had reason to want the victim dead. Sometimes the obvious answer isn't the truth." She hung up and walked to her window, looking down at the street below. There, she could see Marcus's frail figure being helped into a car by a woman with silver hair. Emma, still beside him after everything. Sarah pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching until the car disappeared into London traffic. Thomas Whitfield had inherited his father's eyes, but his mother's fierce determination. At 28, he was already making waves as an investigative journalist for The Guardian, though he had never written about the case that shaped his entire life. That changed the morning he found his father collapsed in their garden flat in Hampstead. The journal he'd guarded for decades clutched against his chest. "Thomas!" Marcus wheezed from his hospital bed, machines monitoring his failing body. "I need you to stop." "Stop?" Thomas gripped his father's hand. "After everything I've found." "Dad, I have proof about Vincent Carver, about Detective Brooks. I know, son. I've always known." Marcus's revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I showed it all to Sarah Pemberton yesterday." Thomas reeled. "You went to her, the woman who was also a victim of deception," Emma interrupted from the doorway. She moved to her husband's bedside with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent decades in hospitals, though usually as the doctor, not the visitor. "Your father made a choice, Thomas. One I've lived with every day since." The story tumbled out. The blackmail, the threats, the impossible choice. Thomas listened, his journalist's instincts warring with his son's rage. "You let them destroy our lives to protect us? I let them take my freedom to preserve yours," Marcus corrected. "You had a childhood, an education, a mother who could provide for you. That was worth any prison sentence." Thomas paced the small room, processing 23 years of lies and sacrifices. "And Pemberton? What did she say?" She'll help with the Jameson case, make sure another innocent person doesn't suffer for appearance's sake. That's not enough, Thomas exploded. She owes us nothing, Marcus said firmly. But she owes the truth everything, as do you. That evening, Thomas sat in his flat, surrounded by 5 years of investigation, boxes of documents, hard drives full of interviews with witnesses too scared to speak officially, financial records painstakingly reconstructed from fragments. His phone rang, Sarah Pemberton's office. Mr. Whitfield, this is Sarah Pemberton. I believe we should meet. They met at the same cafe where Marcus had first broken his silence to Sarah. She looked older than her press photos, Thomas thought, worn down by the weight of what she'd learned. Your father is remarkable, Sarah began. I've spent my career believing I could read guilt and innocence in people's faces, their voices. His silence convinced me. His silence was love, Thomas interrupted coldly. Something you couldn't recognize because you were too focused on winning. Sarah absorbed the blow without flinching. You're right. I was ambitious, ruthless even. But I want to make this right. He's dying, Thomas said flatly. There is no making it right. No, but there's making it matter. Sarah pulled out a folder. The Jameson case. I've had it reopened as a full investigation. 3 other cases from Detective Brooks' tenure are under review. I've also spoken to the Lord Chancellor about establishing a commission to review cases where defendants remain silent throughout their trials. Thomas studied her, seeing genuine remorse beneath the professional veneer. And my father. I've filed for a posthumous pardon. It won't pass before, but it will pass. I'll make sure of it. She paused. I'm also prepared to make a public statement about the case, about my role in the miscarriage of justice. That would end your career. Perhaps it should. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Your father taught me something yesterday, that some silences speak louder than words, and some truths are worth more than reputation. Thomas considered her offer. I have one condition. You tell his story, not as the silent prisoner, but as Marcus Whitfield, the man who chose his family over his freedom. Use your platform, your connections. Make sure everyone knows what kind of man he really was. Sarah extended her hand. You have my word. As they shook hands, Thomas's phone buzzed. Emma, come quickly. The hospice room was bathed in afternoon light, autumn sun painting golden squares across Marcus's bed. The cancer had taken its toll with breathtaking speed. 3 weeks from release to this moment, family gathered as his breathing grew labored. But Marcus's eyes remained alert, focused on the small recording device Thomas had placed on the bedside table. For the record, Marcus began, his voice thin but clear. I am Marcus James Whitfield, and this is my truth. Sarah stood in the corner, having been summoned by Emma despite Thomas's initial protests. She held a legal pad, documenting what would become the most important testimony of her career, one given not in a courtroom, but in a room filled with the presence of approaching death and enduring love. I was silent for 8 to 401 days, Marcus continued, not out of guilt, but out of love. People think silence is empty, but mine was full of every word I wanted to say to defend myself, every cry of innocence I swallowed, every explanation I buried to keep my family safe. Emma held his hand, tears flowing freely. Their daughter Lucy, born while Marcus was in prison and now 22, sat on his other side, meeting the father she'd only known through glass partitions and supervised visits. Daniel Hayes was killed on October 3, 1998, at approximately 6:47 p.m. I know this precisely because I was at home, helping Thomas with his homework, teaching him about the water cycle. I still remember cumulus clouds and precipitation. A faint smile crossed his lips. When the police called at 8 p.m., I went to identify the body. In my shock, I picked up the paperweight. That single moment of human reaction sealed my fate. He paused, gathering strength. Vincent Carver killed Daniel over a £40,000 debt. I learned this 3 days before my trial, when Carver himself told me. He sat in my living room drinking tea Emma had made and explained how my silence would buy my family's safety. He knew about Emma's situation, knew about the falsified documents Daniel had created. He promised that if I spoke, Lucy, still unborn, would grow up visiting both parents in prison. "Dad, you don't have to," Lucy began, but Marcus squeezed her hand. "I do, sweetheart. You deserve to know why you grew up without me." He looked at his daughter with infinite tenderness. "Every milestone I missed, every birthday, every graduation, I lived them through your mother's letters, through photos tucked under my pillow. You were my hope, Lucy, the future I was protecting." Thomas activated another recording device, his journalist's instincts ensuring multiple backups. "Tell us about prison, Dad. 23 years of silence. How did you survive?" Marcus's gaze grew distant. "You create a different kind of voice. I wrote letters I never sent, journals I kept hidden. I helped other prisoners with their appeals, learned law from the library, always careful never to draw attention to my own case. 3 men died trying to help me. I carry their names like stones: Jeffrey Hartwell, Robert Chen, Martin Okonkwo. Good men who believed in justice." Sarah stepped forward. "Marcus, I need to ask for the record. Why reveal this now? Why break your silence?" Marcus turned to her, no anger in his expression, only a profound weariness. "Because silence, like lies, eventually becomes a poison. It protected my family for 23 years, but now it threatens to define them. Thomas drowning in anger, Lucy growing up with shame, Emma carrying guilt for a choice I made. My silence has served its purpose. Now, only truth can heal." "Ishi?" He gestured weakly toward a box in the corner. "Thomas, there's something else. Letters from Daniel's widow, Margaret. She wrote to me every year on the anniversary. She knew Sarah. She always knew her husband was involved with dangerous people. She was too frightened to speak then, but she's willing to speak now." Sarah immediately pulled out her phone, making arrangements to contact Margaret Hayes. This could change everything, a witness who could corroborate the larger conspiracy. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his voice growing fainter. "Sarah, in my journal, page 247, a list of cases, other defendants who remained silent, whose families showed signs of distress during trials. I spent years researching from prison. Some might still be saved." Emma leaned close to her husband. "That's enough, my love. Rest now." But Marcus had one more truth to tell. "Emma, that night before my arrest, when I told you I'd handle everything, you knew, didn't you? You knew what I was about to do." Emma nodded, tears streaming. "I knew you'd protect us, the way you always had. And I knew I'd wait for you, the way I always would." The video of Marcus's deathbed testimony went viral within hours of Thomas publishing it on the Guardian's website. "The Silent Prisoner Speaks, A Father's Sacrifice," garnered 3 million views in its first day. The public response was immediate and overwhelming: outrage at the system, sympathy for the Whitfield family, and demands for justice reform. Sarah Pemberton stood before the Lord Chancellor's Emergency Commission, her reputation in tatters, but her resolve stronger than ever. "My lords, I stand before you not just as a QC, but as someone who participated in a grave miscarriage of justice. Marcus Whitfield died 3 days ago, finally free, but forever marked by a system that failed to protect the innocent. The Jameson case had been dropped after Sarah's investigation revealed evidence of police coercion and witness tampering. Detective Inspector Michael Hartley was suspended pending investigation. The dominoes were falling, each revealing deeper corruption within the system. "We prioritize conviction rates over truth," Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the packed chamber. "We mistake silence for guilt, poverty for criminality, and expedience for justice. Marcus Whitfield's case is not an anomaly. It's a symptom of a diseased system that values appearance over substance." Outside the Royal Courts of Justice, Emma Whitfield stood with her children, addressing the gathered media. At 68, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had endured the unendurable. "My husband died as he lived. Protecting others, Emma said, her voice steady despite her grief. But no one should have to choose between freedom and family. No one should have to remain silent to survive. We're establishing the Marcus Whitfield Foundation for Justice Reform, focusing on defendants who maintain their innocence through silence, who might be protecting something or someone we can't see. Lucy stepped forward, having found her voice in the days since her father's death. I grew up believing my father was a murderer. I was ashamed to carry his name. Now I know he was the bravest man I'll never truly know. 23 years of visiting him in prison, and he never once complained, never once explained. He just loved us, fiercely and silently. Thomas had thrown himself into investigating the cases Marcus had identified. Already 2 convictions had been overturned, revealing similar patterns of coercion and threat. My father left us a roadmap, he told the BBC, not just to clear his name, but to save others trapped in the same impossible situation. Margaret Hayes, Daniel's widow, had finally broken her own silence. In a televised interview, she revealed years of domestic abuse, gambling debts, and connections to organized crime. I was relieved when Daniel died, she admitted, shocking the nation. But I was horrified when Marcus was convicted. I knew he wasn't capable of murder, but I was too frightened of Vincent Carver to speak. My silence cost Marcus everything, and the Metropolitan Police announced a comprehensive review of all cases handled by Detective Inspector Brooks and his team over a 15-year period. 17 convictions were immediately flagged for review. Sarah faced her own reckoning at the Bar Disciplinary Tribunal. I don't seek forgiveness, she stated. I seek transformation. I was part of a system that valued winning over truth. Marcus Whitfield's silence taught me that sometimes the most profound truths are unspoken, and the greatest courage is in sacrifice no one sees. Her license was suspended for 2 years, but she was permitted to work with the Whitfield Foundation in an advisory capacity. It was there, in a small office overlooking the Thames, that she found herself working alongside Thomas. You know, Thomas said one afternoon, reviewing case files, my father would have found this ironic, you and I working together. Sarah looked up from her documents. He would have called it redemption. He believed in second chances, even for those who didn't deserve them. Do you think you deserve one? Sarah considered the question. No, but I think your father would want me to take it anyway. He understood that justice isn't about deserving. It's about becoming better than we were. 1 year after Marcus Whitfield's death, the Royal Courts of Justice unveiled a memorial plaque in the hall outside Courtroom 1. It read, "In memory of all those whose silence spoke truths the law failed to hear. Justice delayed is justice denied, but truth endures." The ceremony was attended by hundreds, former prisoners whose cases had been reviewed, families reunited after wrongful convictions, and legal professionals committed to reform. Emma stood at the podium, her husband's journal in her hands. Marcus wrote something the night before he died, she began, her voice carrying the weight of love and loss. Silence is not empty. It is full of everything we cannot say, everything we dare not speak, everything we sacrifice for love. But there comes a time when silence must break, like dawn after the longest night, to illuminate what darkness has hidden. The Marcus Whitfield Act had passed Parliament 6 months after his death, requiring courts to investigate when defendants remained completely silent, mandating psychological evaluation and investigation into potential coercion. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. Thomas had written a book about his father's case, donating all proceeds to the foundation. Standing beside his mother, he thought about the last conversation with his father. Was it worth it, Dad? 23 years for our safety? Marcus had smiled, his eyes already seeing beyond this world. Every second, son. Love isn't measured in time together, but in willingness to sacrifice. Your mother's freedom, your education, Lucy's existence, worth every moment of silence. Lucy had followed in her mother's footsteps, but instead of medicine, she chose law. She stood in the same courtroom where her father had been convicted, delivering her first closing argument as a defense barrister. "My client remained silent throughout these proceedings," she stated, "and I ask you to consider why, not as evidence of guilt, but as a possibility of something deeper: fear, protection, love, or circumstances beyond our understanding." Sarah Pemberton, reinstated to practice but choosing to work exclusively on appeals for the wrongfully convicted, watched from the gallery. She had aged considerably in the past year, the weight of her transformation visible in every line. After the verdict, not guilty, she approached Lucy. "Your father would be proud," Sarah said simply. Lucy studied the woman who had prosecuted her father. "He forgave you, you know. In his final days, he said you were as much a victim of the system as he was." "I was a willing victim," Sarah corrected. "That's the difference. Your father's sacrifice was born of love. Mine was born of ambition. And now? Now I try to honor his memory by being the prosecutor I should have been. One who seeks truth, not just conviction." Vincent Carver's organization had been dismantled following the revelations, though Carver himself had died years before facing justice. Detective Brooks, despite his condition, had been stripped of his pension and honors. Small consolations for a life destroyed, but symbols that the system could, however slowly, correct itself. The final scene of Marcus's story played out in Highgate Cemetery, where his ashes were interred beside a simple stone bearing only his name and dates. No epitaph. Emma said his life needed no summary that words could capture. Thomas stood with his family as autumn leaves fell around them. The same season his father had been convicted 24 years ago. "Do you think he knew," Thomas asked his mother, "that one day his silence would speak louder than any defense?" Emma took her son's hand, her daughter's hand in her other. "Your father understood something most of us never learn, that the most profound love often requires the greatest sacrifice, and the truest strength is in enduring injustice to protect those we cherish." As they walked away, a figure remained by the grave, Sarah Pemberton, placing a single white rose on the fresh earth. She spoke to the stone, to the man who had transformed her understanding of justice. "You were right, Marcus. Some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to teach. Your silence taught me more than 20 years of practicing law. I promise you, I will spend whatever time I have left making sure no one else has to make the choice you did." The wind carried her words across the cemetery, through the trees that had stood witness to centuries of sorrow and redemption. In the distance, London continued its endless rhythm, unaware that in one quiet grave lay a man whose silence had finally, powerfully spoken. Marcus Whitfield's legacy lived not in the words he never said, but in the lives he saved through his sacrifice, his family protected and whole. The wrongfully convicted now free, and a system slowly, painfully, learning that justice must listen not only to what is said, but to what cannot be spoken. In the end, his silence had been his testimony, and his love his greatest truth.